glory days. A time we will always remember, events we will never forget. A time we know we'll never duplicate. A time when everything just lines up. The stars, the moon, the sun, but usually only lasting for a short period. The glory days of racing looked like this, with names like Donahue, Fulmer, and Penske.
Mark Donahue now leads, followed by George Fulmer, who has come all the way from 7th position.
The glory days of the big three were when they worried about racing, not Toyota or Honda. The glory days for us was when we could walk into a dealership and for under $5 grand buy a brand new muscle car. Rivalries were settled on the racetrack, the street, and in the dealership showrooms. Chevy, Ford, and Chrysler guys taunted one another. AMC guys just wanted to be taunted. With the success of Trans Am racing, muscle car buyers were suddenly demanding what Europeans had always had, cars that handled. But they also had an interest in quarter-mile performance and looks, which included huge scoops, spoilers, and wild stripes. During the glory days of Trans Am, every manufacturer had their day in the sun. Ford with the Mustang winning in 1966, 67, and 70. Chevy with the Z28 striking championships in 1968 and 9. And then finally in 1971, AMC winning their first championship with Roger Penske in the Donahue AMC Javelin. Chrysler finally entered the fray in 1970. Let's face it, these were highly modified cars compared to the vehicles that you bought from the local dealer. Which car on the street was the best handling, all-around performing car, and how much different were they from their racing cousins? The stars have lined up once again at LMC. We've assembled 4 of the best Trans Am-inspired muscle cars: the Javelin, the Z28, the Boss 302, and the Challenger TA. In true Dream Car Garage fashion, we're going to test them, thrash them, and declare the best Trans Am-inspired muscle car. Welcome to another in the series of Dream Car Garage Shootouts.
Well, this year, unlike last year, we're going to focus on the small block cars, and not just any small block cars. We're going to focus on the cars that were inspired by the Trans Am series. Let's face it, a lot of these muscle cars were built because they wanted to be homologated in order to go Trans Am racing.
There's so much myth and mystery, and there's so many fish tales told about you know, what the cars would do and how they would run. The whole entire muscle car era is just a big fish tale anymore, of cars that could boil the tires at 100 miles per hour, and you hear all sorts of stories.
You know, if you're going to put something together like this and then put it out there for everyone to see and take shots at, then you better do it properly. And I think, you know, you guys do it properly. You make it as scientific as you possibly can. You know, you're going to have a controlled tire, for example. And
your newer tire construction is actually a lot more, I should say, responsive, because the carcass is a lot firmer. You also have a lot less sidewall. You'll get a lot more body roll as far as in the cornering. He'll feel a lot more quicker reaction.
Cars like the Boss 302, that motor was built specifically for Trans Am racing. Cars like this 69 Z28, the 302, high revving motor, again ideal for Trans Am racing. Later, when the Challenger TA came into the fray, it was because of a rule change. They were allowed to de-stroke the 340 to under 305 cubic inches. Eventually, the Mark Donahue Javelin made its way to the street as well as the racetrack in 71 and 72. To make things even more interesting, what we did is we brought out a period-correct 69 Z28 Trans Am car. This car actually competed in the Trans Am series back then. All of these cars here were built specifically to go around corners as well as a straight line.
No doubt about it, the salad days of American racing. Big names, huge crowds going to see them, and a lot of cars in the parking lot were just like the ones on the track. So for a shootout, we have our usual array of tests. Here we're at Toronto Motorsports Park, where Peter's going to do some 0 to 60 times and then the full quarter mile. Then we'll go over to our test track, which is about 30 kilometers in that direction. We're going to do a slalom test, then a 60 to 0 test, and then do what these cars were really meant to do in the first place, go around a road course. It's 2 laps and 2 laps only. This is going to be a lot of fun. Coming up, Peter will go 0 to 60 in all 5 cars. On last season's Muscle Car Shootout, we used 3 different devices to do all the timing and calibration, and Peter doesn't like to read instructions, neither do I. We were worried about the quality of the data, so we heard about this thing called Track Systems, or TrackMate. That's TrackMate with a Q. This is Glenn Stevens. Now, his says that his device not only has 3 accelerometers in it, but a GPS device. So that allows the thing to draw a track map all by itself. It'll do the 0 to 60, it'll do the quarter mile, it'll get through the road course, show Peter every foot of that road course, and what he does from lap to lap. It'll actually do Ultimate G in the slalom, and it'll actually do all of our tests in one format for one data. So if you're gonna get that thing installed, you better hurry up.
All right, done.
Not bad. So why the 0 to 60 test? Probably because the speed limit was 60 miles an hour as the Enthusiast magazine started up. That index number, 0 to 60, became very important.
I think the first run, we're not having a problem with wheel spin with this car at all. The first one, it came out pretty good, but it just doesn't feel like it has any grunt. The second one, we hooked up real good. It pulled pretty good from 0 to 60. I think that's going to be our best 0 to 60 time for this car. I think the second run was the fastest. The first one we had a little bit of wheel hop. The second one seemed to hook up just nice. The third one I tried a little bit more RPM, thinking I could get out of the hole a little bit better, and I ended up spinning the wheels.
Credit GM with offering a real Trans Am car to the public clear back in 1967. It wasn't even really pushed or promoted by Chevrolet when the option was released. Many of the dealerships didn't even know that the Z28 package exists.
Of all the Z28s built, the 69 is probably the most popular. It was the styling, the performance, everything came together in 69. The number built, you know, was pretty big. There were quite a few of those cars built.
The Z28 package in 1969 was so attractive that everybody who didn't have a Z28 bought the badges and painted on the stripes and made their car look like a Z28. In 69, GM sold 20,000 Z28s, and then their customer base probably cloned about 40,000 more since then.
As it compares to the Trans Am series, you know, it's amazing.
The 69 Z28 with the 302, almost a perfect bore-stroke combination, high revving. 202 intake, a 160 exhaust. You could get optional 2 4-barrel setup in the form of a cross ram. By 69, they had 2 double pumper Hollies on that cross ram. It was an expensive option, came in the trunk, well worth it. Well, rear ends, you could also get a JL8 brake package. Ultra rare package, maybe 200 of those actually found their ways into 69 Z28s. Transmission, you could only get a 4-speed M20, M21, or M22. A 12-volt with a 373 was standard in the Z. Of course, you had handling. There was nothing that quite handled as far as Chevy had produced like the 69 Z28. They had it all dialed in, heavy-duty suspension. They had the bigger radiator. If you look at today's market, the 69 Z28 has eclipsed virtually every other car, especially the loaded up cars. You find a car with a JL8 and a cross ram well into the 6 figures today. Z28's just a great all-around piece. I think the last run was probably the best as far as getting out of the hole. The biggest problem with these small blocks is they come out, you can see the front end lift, it's launching good weight transfer, hooking up nice, and then there's just not enough motor to keep pulling it through. These small motors just don't make big torque. To 60 time, I think again, the last run was the best. First run didn't get enough RPM, just kind of bogged and, you know, farted and kicked over on itself. The second one, again, same sort of thing, just not enough RPM. And the third one just slipped the clutch a little bit and it worked really nice out of the hole. I think that's going to be our best time for 0 to 60. Obviously a road race car. I mean, this car First gear just does not work out of the hole. Our 0 to 60 time isn't going to be real good, but I got to get over 5,000 RPM in first gear before it starts doing anything. We got a tiny little clutch in this thing, really hard to get out of the hole. It's not what it's designed for.
In the 0 to 60 test, the Challenger is a full half-second quicker than the Mustang and Camaro, which are in turn a half-second quicker than the Javelin. And even in this heat, with the tall first gear, the Trans Am car goes 595. Coming up, the quarter-mile test. This portion of the Muscle Car Shootout is brought to you by Intercity Lines Incorporated, America's premier enclosed auto transport company. 1,320 feet is a quarter mile. It's mostly concrete and it's covered in all this black rubber stuff.
Tom, why did we have to walk all the way?
Every good road racer walks the track before he runs it.
This isn't a road race. It's from A to B in a straight line.
Yeah, well, we know that now. See, and you may not have had that knowledge, but hey, it wasn't the greatest idea.
Did you find anything?
Yeah, I did. I found this pen. It got run over, but I think it's still good.
Well, that'll come in handy for all those autographs you got to give those college girls, huh? You keep telling me.
It'll happen. I'm certain. Never mind that. Peter's going to run all the cars down the 1,320 feet here at Toronto Motorsports Park. But what you can't see, or maybe you can if you can see my forehead, is that it's about 100 degrees, and that's ambient. So the track temperature that we're standing on is about 140 degrees. This isn't the kind of day we're going to get the best out of these cars. They're not really drag racing cars anyway, but comparatively speaking, maybe there's something to learn. That is, if you don't screw up.
I'm not even going to respond.
Yes, how dignified of him.
I think the first run was probably the best. We came out of the hole okay. The problem with these motors really is they're road race motors. It's got ports and the valves the size of a Chevy. It makes no torque, doesn't have big cubic inch. So really on the top end, you're using just RPM. To make one of these work, you got to run a really big gear. We're running a 391. That's as good it's going to get, especially with the temperature. I mean, it's got to be getting close to 100, and at 6,000 RPM, it just feels like it's starving for fuel. It probably has some vapor lock. We had that one run there, it was just great. This car really pulls on top end. I don't think the other cars are going to be as strong as this car in the top end. And obviously with the mile an hour and ET, just having a little bit of problem hooking up the car, that's probably me. We get 3 runs to it. First one, we got some wheel hop. Second one was good. Third one, a lot of wheel spin. If you had more time in the car, it might get it to hook up and get it into the 13s.
You know, Javelin was always kind of fighting a tough battle. You know, the Camaro and the Mustang were wildly popular. Starting in '70, you know, the Chrysler entrants, the Coupe and the Challenger, you know, proved to be extremely popular.
Javelins didn't have anything going for them in the 70s and the 80s because of the AMX. Now, the AMX didn't race in Trans Am, but the AMX was kind of the slicker looking, the 2-seater, the lighter. It was the more collectible car. So the Javelin, for all these years, has been relegated to second best and was not a very collectible car at all in the late 70s and early 80s. When a car is not collectible, even if it's a good car and a nice car like a Javelin is, when it's not collectible and becomes just a cheap used car, they get used, abused, and most of them land in the junkyards. So finding a really nice, tight, factory original 360 Javelin, that had to have been a trick to pull out of the hat, because there's just not that many out there, and then the people who own them probably aren't too wild about seeing one sliding through a corner.
Well, when AMC entered the fray in 1968, nobody really gave the little company any hope at ever winning a Trans Am championship. But in 1969, they actually started to do something that shocked the world. They started talking to Penske. Well, by 1971, they pulled it off. They won the championship and won it again in '72. An unbelievable feat the little AMC Javelin. Well, what about the street car? What did it get? Well, the 360 motor was actually de-stroked to 304 cubic inches. That was the rule, remember, 305 for Trans Am. The frame on this car is basically a unibody construction, very much like the Mustang. Matter of fact, the whole suspension is a lot more like a Mustang than anything else out there. So handling, it's going to be very similar to a Mustang. Performance-wise on the street, you actually have 360 cubic inches. It's going to actually perform almost a little bit better than the Boss 302 for the simple fact that you got a lot of torque out of that 360-inch motor. The motor in these cars, they were somewhere in 10.5 to 1 compression. Again, nothing major, nothing radical like the Boss or the 69 Z28, or for that matter, even the 340. Just a plain Jane 360, but with lots of torque. The first run felt pretty good, but just didn't have any top-end grunt. This 360 motor just doesn't seem to want to pull. The third run, it just bogged off the line. I think the second run's going to be the best. I'm a little disappointed. I thought the 360 would be a little stronger than this, you know, and we'll see what the other cars, if they're any stronger, but maybe it's the heat. I mean, we're almost 100 degrees today. Everything might run a little slow today. Second run's definitely going to be the run. The third run, it just jammed in third gear. These shifters aren't that great. Wasn't that it didn't go into third, it wouldn't come out of third gear, so we ended up going through the traps in third gear. So obviously the third run isn't going to be very good. First two runs were pretty good. Again, trying to get these things to hook with the right amount of wheel spin so it doesn't bog after it kind of hooks up is the trick. All in all, pretty impressive little car. The first half of the ride is totally uneventful. This gearing in the transmission is for a road race car. The second half, though, man, does it start pulling hard.
In the quarter-mile test, it was the Challenger that shone, nearly a full second quicker than the Camaro and Mustang, which are only a tenth apart, and the Javelin is a half second back from them. The Trans Am car pulls off at 12:33. So after two tests, the Challenger leads with 8 points, the Z28 and the Boss 302 are tied, the Javelin has 2. Up after the break, we break. Now, the whole thing about a braking test isn't just the distance that it takes to stop. It's, does that stop become an event? Does the car tend to lock up? Does it tend to lose control? Or in this case, is the moron driving it missing by 5 feet?
Oh, was I supposed to stop behind you? That would have been terrible.
The thing is that if he'd have hit me, he would have been upset.
About the car?
Yeah, about the car.
Well, first two stops were good. The last one just spun me right around. I had a hard time keeping it on the track. I think the distances will be okay, but we'll see.
As far as braking differences, we really didn't upgrade the weight of the wheel that much from the OE factory steels. So as far as your braking feel will be a lot more responsive. It'll actually stop probably quicker because of the contact patch is wider. You have a better footprint, so it'll be a noticeable difference in the braking.
That's sort of the problem we're battling with all the cars here. They all have power brakes, and what's happening is I'm loading down real hard. I guess what's happening is the carb isn't working as well as it should, and it's starting to stall, and then I'm losing my power brakes. So I'm trying to brake, keep the motor running, have the clutch in all at once. So it's interesting, let's put it that way.
When you think of a 340 TA, you just think of wild, outlandish styling. When you think of the big three as a family, the Mopars are always kind of the wacky, crazy uncle. 340 TAs always make me grin when I see them out on the show field and I see them in my travels, because the crazy colors, the bold graphics, the exhaust spitting out in front of the rear wheel, it's just a neat trick car. You can imagine, you know, I'm younger. I wasn't driving back when these cars were available, but I can just imagine being 20, 25 years old back in the day and walking into a showroom and just seeing all that eye candy. How could you possibly resist buying that car with, you know, with 3 carburetors lined up and the cool exhaust and just the stance and the high rear end look it had to it? They were really suckering young guys into buying those cars, I think, back then, with just all the styling and eye candy that came with that.
Enthusiasts are the kind of people that, you know, they tend to like function over form, and in performance capability and speed, we see beauty. So if you look at the hood scoop and the spoilers and of course the striping, it doesn't hurt either. But if you look at all those things, it makes the car look fast. All those things were there to make the car run fast on the racetrack.
They were also extremely durable cars and reliable cars. At the times, in the late 60s, early 70s, Mopar really did build a reputation of building high-performance drivelines that didn't break and weren't quite as fragile as what was coming out of the other 2 manufacturers. With the smaller motor, that chassis really worked a whole lot better.
With Trans Am changing the rules, allowing motors to be de-stroked, that allowed Chrysler to get into the game. With the Dodge TA Challenger, they had a natural. 340 de-stroked within the 305 legal limit. They were going to have a great performing little piece. Now, could they make this car handle? That was the big question. Well, let's face it, Penske had been dominant. The Bud Moore team had been dominant with the Mustangs. Could Chrysler do the same? Well, it just wasn't in the cards. They had 3 third-place finishes and 1 fourth, but don't kid yourself, those were not photo finish races. Now on the street, what did we get out of this? We got a great performing package in the TA Challenger. The TA in the engine compartment, what did it have? Well, it had the TA block. It had 3 two-barrel Hollies on top of an aluminum Edelbrock intake. They re-arced the rear leaf spring so you had a bigger weight in the back to get that bigger tire underneath. You also had a G60 series tire on this car, which really helped the performance around corners as well. As far as a straight line, there's no question this little 340 is going to perform. Just a car that's really difficult to modulate the brake pedal. It seems like it wants to grab this way. Might be a good idea to just adjust the brakes on this car, but we've run them all day long and we're not going to start tinkering with them and tuning them. We're just going to leave them the way we've been running them on all the events. So I think this one could be a little bit better if we started playing with the brakes, but ultimately it is what it is. The last one was definitely the best. The first one just locked it up a little too much. The second one was pretty good. The last one, I think this is going to be the best. It feels like the best braking car of the bunch anyway. We'll see. The distance will tell. As far as braking goes, car brakes well. Got to, again, modulate the gas pedal or it'll stall. We're just stopping too hard. Normally on a race car, you're not bringing it right to a complete stop. So what's happening is the fuel is getting sloshed so far forward that we're actually starving the motor. Anyway, I think this will definitely be the fastest stopping distance, but we'll see.
In the braking test, the Javelin stops 1 foot shorter than the Camaro, and surprisingly, the Mustang ends up in last place. So after 3 tests, the Challenger is still in the lead, the Camaro's in second, and the Mustang and Javelin are tied for third. Coming up, the slalom test. Every car test involves a slalom test of some kind. We space cones about 60 feet apart. We ask Peter to drive through them as fast as he can. And with TrackMate, we're going to be able to measure the lateral G as well as the time and distance between A and B. So all Peter has to do is go as fast as he can without screwing up.
Shouldn't be a problem.
Which is going to be now the pylons are those conical orange things.
There?
No.
I heard you were moving pylon.
But you'll recognize them as a hat.
Oh.
All right? Just go as fast as you can and let's get this over with.
Well, your older bias plies in the 70s and pre-82, the sidewalls crisscrossed, and it was a lot thicker construction, a lot stiffer. That's why you didn't get that little sag in the sidewall. Newer construction, what's called radial construction, where the plies go straight up and down perpendicular to the bead, with the bead, which is basically where it meets the rim. That construction gives you a little more squattiness. That's why you get the little kind of squattiness in your tires. When you look at them, they look like they're low compared to the older ones. And basically, the evolution of technology, they brought the radial in more and more because they saw the advantages of the stronger tire.
The difference between a bias ply and a radial tire is vast. So we took the car in first place and compared the two tires.
Boy, you can feel the tire just roll over on itself. Not very fast through the pylons. I think we'll do a lot better with the radial tires. But again, I mean, this is 40-year-old technology compared to modern radials.
The difference between a bias ply tire and a radial tire is obvious when you look at the pictures, but in time it added up to 1.25 seconds, or better than 10%.
Tell you this much, a set of radial tires compared to a set of bias ply, night and day. Well, we tried two different things. In the first run, I came in a little bit slow, trying to just carry momentum without getting the back end loose. In the second run, I came in a little bit harder. The car swayed around a little bit more. In the third run, I tried combining the two. I think the third will be the best of the bunch. First one I tried cutting a little tight. I think I spat out a pylon. The second one I was a little loose, and the third one, hopefully that's the fast one. This car just doesn't work as well in the tight pylons as I'd hoped it would. The first time, again, I think it's just because it's so hot, the power steering almost went out on me. So I tried it in first gear, hoping to keep the RPM higher so I had more power steering. Didn't work much better. The third one, I think, is going to be the best of the bunch. We went back to second gear and just tried staying real tight to the pylons. All in all, I think it could work better, but it's just so hot, I think all the power steering is boiling. Cold tires, race tires on this track. I took out a couple pylons the first couple runs. Actually, the car works real good, but you got to use the throttle to get the back end around this way and that way, and that's why we took out some pylons. And obviously, cold race tires doesn't help, but I'm certain this will still have the fastest time.
The first three cars in the slalom test are covered by a single 1/10 of a second. The Challenger is back 2/10 of a second. So after 4 tests, the Challenger and the Camaro are tied, followed by the Mustang and the Javelin. When we come back, we'll send all 5 cars through the road course.
Well, let's face it, half the reason these cars ever got built is because the manufacturers wanted to go Trans Am racing. But the Trans Am cars were far from stock. I mean, they had 450 horsepower, Penske's team unfair advantage. They were cheating, weren't they?
Just like Peter did when he drove Trans Am.
Easy.
Now, if you've seen this show, you know this course. It's about 1.2 miles. It's kind of tight, and Peter's only going to get 2 laps. It's an attention span thing. But also, we've tested these cars on this track before, or cars like them, and there isn't much more than 2 laps in them. So he gets a warm-up, 2 hot ones, and then a cool-down. We'll see who king of the hill in the street cars is.
Is that usually you on the outside there? Just ready to get into the rhubarb?
Optimistic. And this is normally Peter here, thinking that if I cut the corner, then any...
This is the fast way.
It's the dirty way, and he owns body shop, so...
anyway, this car is going to pull hard and pull away, I think, from everything else. You really need a racing seat in one of these cars. I am pleasantly surprised on how well this car performs. I can't believe the braking. I can't believe how neutral the car is around the corners. The car is actually a pleasure to drive. The only thing that I don't like about it is the pedal's so far over to the right you can't toe heel, so you almost have to wait until the last second to grab a gear. We had wheel hop a couple times. Other than that, I'm impressed with this car.
The Boss 302 really cemented Ford's image as hardcore racers, I guess you could say, in the Mustang line. There had been some good performing Mustangs prior to that. Obviously, the Shelbys, of course, would come to mind first thing. Bud Moore's program was just unbelievable. They had a bit of a tire issue in '69. The Firestone Goodyear tire war was going on, and I think the tires let them down a little bit. But as far as just the speed of the car, the Boss 302 typically outran everything else.
The street car that we're using here was really a pretty tight representation of the package that they were racing in Trans Am, and it was a very, very ahead of its time handler.
You look at the Boss 302 and you see, the huge intake ports on it, the aero bits that they did, the size of the wheels and tires, the overall styling of the car. They represent a concerted effort on the part of a manufacturer to win a major race series. And any car that's got that behind it, is going to have provenance, going to have history.
The 302 tunnel port was touted to be the next great thing Ford was coming out with. Well, it ended up being a disaster. They blew up virtually every single race. So by 1969, or for the 1969 season, they realized they had to come up with a motor that was going to work. The Cleveland was already scheduled for production in 1970, and what they came up with is basically putting a Cleveland head on a Windsor block, creating the Boss 302. It had giant valves. In 1969, it had 223-inch intake. By 1970, they had a 219-inch intake. Had a 780 Holley on top, aluminum dual plane intake, 4-bolt mains, 10.4-to-1 compression, steel crank and rods. A motor that was designed to absolutely rev to 7, 8, 9,000 RPM. Well, the rest of the drivetrain, typical Ford, was bulletproof. The top loader, the 9-inch rear end with the 31 spline axles, you just couldn't beat it. Well, by 1970, Ford scaled down their race program and went with one team. It was the Bud Moore team. Well, at this point, Penske had moved on to AMC, and what seemed was no longer a threat. That year, Ford did it all, though. They ended up winning the Manufacturers' Championship and the overall championship that year, and then pulled out of racing. This will be almost a first gear corner. Amazing how a street car can put up with this sort of thrashing, because quite frankly, I'm being pretty hard on the car. Boy, I'll tell you, it's a stinking hot day. At 5,000 RPM, this thing's starting to get vapor locked, so I'm actually having to shift the car fairly early The motor's really not working until 4,000, so we're at RPM. I think the straight line speed is really going to hurt. I think it did great in the corners.
There's less than a second between our first two cars and the road course. We'll do the rest of them when we come back.
As you can see, it's smoking. The brakes are only good for 2 laps. Performance-wise in a straight line, not bad. So much better braking. There's our tire rubbing a little, which is gonna hurt us. Here. The body roll, I think, is going to hurt us in our times because it just wants to push out. I'm having to lift to go from off, keep from going off the track. Probably the best braking car in the bunch. Obviously, we used up the brakes in this car. As far as handling, it just seemed to have a lot more body roll than the Boss 302. As far as straight line performance, just wasn't quite there. Now, I don't know if this motor's a little bit lazy or just maybe the 302 isn't quite as peppy as the 340. All in all, great handling car, great brakes on this car. I just don't know if it's going to pull the number.
In 1968 and 69, Penske and Donahue were virtually unbeatable. Bob Fryer, a racer and a student at the University of Pittsburgh, had close ties to Donahue. With their assistance, this Camaro became one of the most recognized non-factory cars to compete during the heyday of Trans Am. The car competed in the 24 Hours of Daytona and contested the 1970-71 Trans Am and SCCA season. The car is virtually identical today to the way it raced over 3 decades ago.
fun car to drive. Nothing like driving a vintage Trans Am car. These original Goodyear bias-ply tires, you just get them out 5-10 degrees and it feels like you're just sliding around the whole corner. Just an awesome, fun car to drive. It's going to be at least 10-12 seconds a lap faster. This thing just cooks.
Well, we've got our results from TrackMate for the road course, and I might be a bit surprised the Trans Am car was the quickest.
It felt the quickest, too.
It sure looked like the quickest.
How much quicker was it?
13 seconds quicker than the car that was quickest on the road course.
And the most fun to drive.
How would I know? I'm surprised you get in there. Which car felt best to you?
You know what? In a straight line, it just couldn't hook up out of the corners. The TA just had lots of grunt, and obviously that showed up in the quarter mile, but it just couldn't hook up. The Z28 and the Boss 302 both came out of the corners nice. Z28 a little bit more body roll, but it just felt like it got some bite out of the corners, but they're close.
You think they're close?
Yeah.
You're right. They're within 5/100ths of a second. But if you look at the TrackMate data and on the map, you can see these cars and how the dots go around the track. You can see that the TA definitely has an advantage. And
just not handling. The torsion bar suspension just doesn't work, and it didn't work on the racetrack.
Some Mopar guys they think the torsion bar suspension is the best thing that ever happened. So do I. Peter doesn't. You never mentioned the Javelin.
There's a reason. It took Penske to make this thing win, and truth be told, after all the other manufacturers pulled out of the series, that's when the Javelin won. So
there's the road course. Although the Mustang and the Camaro were right there, it's actually the Camaro that edged it out, and then, of course, it was the Mopar, and then the Javelin. Okay, you have to keep in mind that I did the arithmetic for this and a lot of it in my head.
It's not accurate.
Oh, come on. It's just arithmetic. I think I've got it. So the Javelin ends up in 4th place and collecting only 9 points. Peter never really came to terms with the car. He thought it was going to be strong right out of the box because of the extra cubic inches. However, it just didn't deliver that extra power the way that Peter thought it was going to the track. It never really did well except for the braking test, so take that to heart, Javelin owners. Those cars stopped pretty darn well. And then it was the Challenger. This was also a surprise. Peter was very high on this car when he started the test, and it did a lot of things well, but it got edged out by 2 truly great cars. Now, the Mustang ended up in 2nd place, but only by a point to the Camaro. The Mustang did everything well. It got around the track extremely well, and the Achilles heel turned out to be braking where it was 4th. And of course, the Camaro, it comes up with 15 points, and it does everything fairly well. It just didn't do that well in 0 to 60 and drag racing, and it never actually led until the very last test, which was the road course. And of course, the Challenger, very worthy of our attention. Of course, it's a plumb crazy car, so it looks cool.
So what do we do next? You want to drive next time?
I would like to drive. How about we do mid-50s? Okay, we could do that. We'd do mid-50s sports racers, and I could just kind of lay on top of them as to drive them. But a supercar shootout sounds good. Maybe we'll do that the next time, and we'll catch you here on the next Dream Car Shootout series. Javelin got 8 points, and it actually did pretty well in the braking. It tied with the Camaro and was 2nd in the slalom, which actually surprised me.
No, it's the other way around, dude. It's 3rd in the slalom, okay? And it did pretty good in the braking. 3 points. So, you'll confuse the hell out of people.
I'm confused myself. Here we go.